That chain doesn't belong to you, kid. Hand it over before I take it myself. The voice, sharp and cold, cut through the air like a blade. A young boy, standing in the dimly lit aisle of a corner store, froze in his tracks. His fingers clutched the delicate gold chain around his neck, a gift from his father, a symbol of love and pride. But to the man towering over him, the badge on his chest gleaming with misplaced authority, it was nothing more than an opportunity to assert power. "I didn't steal this, sir. It's mine," the boy stammered, his voice trembling but resolute. The officer smirked, stepping closer, his boots echoing ominously against the tiled floor. "You people always have excuses. A chain like that doesn't belong to someone like you," he spat, grabbing the chain with one hand and yanking it free. The boy gasped, his heart pounding in disbelief. The other customers in the store, too fearful or indifferent, turned their eyes away, pretending not to see. The humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain could. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he bit his lip, refusing to cry in front of the man who had stripped him not just of the chain, but of his dignity. "That chain doesn't belong to you, kid. Hand it over before I take it myself." The voice, sharp and cold, cut through the air like a blade. A young boy, standing in the dimly lit aisle of a corner store, froze in his tracks. His fingers clutched the delicate gold chain around his neck, a gift from his father, a symbol of love and pride. But to the man towering over him, the badge on his chest gleaming with misplaced authority, it was nothing more than an opportunity to assert power. "I didn't steal this, sir. It's mine," the boy stammered, his voice trembling but resolute. The officer smirked, stepping closer, his boots echoing ominously against the tiled floor. "You people always have excuses. A chain like that doesn't belong to someone like you," he spat, grabbing the chain with one hand and yanking it free. The boy gasped, his heart pounding in disbelief. The other customers in the store, too fearful or indifferent, turned their eyes away, pretending not to see. The humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain could. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he bit his lip, refusing to cry in front of the man who had stripped him not just of the chain, but of his dignity. "You were just abusing your power, humiliating a child, acting on your prejudice, and now you're going to face the consequences." The tension in the room was electric. The boy stood frozen, watching his father's calm yet fiery demeanor dismantle the officer's facade. For the first time, the boy felt a glimmer of hope, but it was tangled with a storm of emotions: anger, shame, and a burning need for justice. The officer stammered, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the federal agent's glare. I was just doing my job." "No," the father replied, his voice like steel. "Your job is to serve and protect. What you did today was abuse and theft, and I'm going to make sure you're held accountable." As the confrontation escalated, the officer found himself cornered, his bravado melting into panic. But the real storm was yet to come. What happened next would leave everyone who witnessed it stunned, and the fallout would shake the very system that allowed men like this officer to thrive. What would a father do when his child's dignity is stripped away in such a cruel and public manner? How far would justice go to reclaim what was lost? And what consequences await a man who believed his badge made him untouchable? The answers will leave you speechless. Stay with us and find out how this story unfolds. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. Your experiences and your voice matter, and we are committed to sharing stories that highlight resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. You are seen, you are valued, and you deserve respect and dignity in every space you occupy. Now, get ready for an emotional, impactful story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and join us on this journey. Enjoy the story. The air was heavy with the thick scent of rain-soaked pavement as Marcus Freeman stepped into the corner store. His mind was still buzzing from the excitement of the soccer game earlier that afternoon. At just 14 years old, Marcus was tall for his age, with a wiry frame that spoke to hours spent sprinting across fields and dodging defenders. His dark skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and his shy smile hinted at a quiet confidence. Around his neck hung a gold chain, a gift from his father, Elijah Freeman, who had given it to him on his last birthday. "Something to remind you of who you are," Elijah had said, fastening the chain around Marcus's neck with a proud smile. Elijah Freeman was a man of unwavering principles, a senior agent with the FBI. He had built a reputation for his meticulous nature and commitment to justice. At home, though, he was simply Dad to Marcus and Eli to his wife, Vanessa. He was the kind of father who left early in the morning, but always made it back in time to ask about his son's day. Elijah had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Atlanta, where opportunities were scarce and the odds were stacked against young black men. But his resilience and determination had carried him far, instilling in him the belief that integrity and hard work were the keys to changing the narrative. That belief was now the foundation of everything he taught Marcus. Vanessa Freeman, a nurse and the grounding force of the family, had a warmth about her that made everyone feel seen. She had met Elijah in college, back when he was just a young man with big dreams and an unshakable sense of purpose. Together, they had built a life centered on love, respect, and the understanding that the world wouldn't always be fair, but that they could prepare Marcus to navigate it. The corner store, a small, dimly lit space run by an elderly couple, had always been a familiar place to Marcus. He liked the way the bell jingled when he pushed open the door and the friendly nods from the owners, who had known him since he was a toddler. But today felt different. The energy in the store shifted the moment he walked in, as if the air had grown colder. As Marcus browsed the shelves for his favorite snacks, he became aware of the man standing by the counter. The officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Daniel Cooper, was leaning against the register, a smirk playing on his lips. Sergeant Cooper had been with the local police force for over a decade. He was a man who believed in law and order, but his version of order often veered into intimidation and profiling. He carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked authority, his actions often towing the line between law enforcement and abuse of power. Cooper noticed Marcus almost immediately, his eyes narrowing as he took in the boy's confident stride and the gold chain glinting against his chest. To Cooper, that chain wasn't a symbol of love or family, it was a target. He had made assumptions the moment Marcus walked in, assumptions rooted in prejudice and the belief that someone like Marcus didn't deserve something so valuable. As Marcus approached the counter to pay, Cooper stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The tension was palpable. Marcus froze, unsure of what to say. Cooper's voice was low but filled with menace as he gestured to the chain. "That's a nice piece you've got there. Bet you didn't pay for it." Marcus blinked, confusion giving way to a mix of anger and fear. He clutched the chain instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's mine," he managed, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. Cooper leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "Yours, huh? Don't think I've seen a kid like you wearing something like that unless it's stolen. Hand it over." The humiliation of the moment hit Marcus like a tidal wave. He felt the eyes of the other customers on him, felt the judgment and the fear. His hands shook as he looked up at Cooper, trying to find the courage to speak. But before he could, Cooper reached out, his fingers closing around the chain and yanking it off Marcus's neck with a sharp tug. The sound of the chain snapping was like a gunshot in the quiet store. Marcus gasped, his hand flying to his now empty neck as Cooper held up the chain, inspecting it with mocked curiosity. "Thought so. Cooper said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You don't look like someone who can afford this." Marcus's mind raced. He wanted to scream, to demand his chain back, but he knew how dangerous it could be to challenge someone like Cooper. He had heard the stories, seen the videos. Black boys like him didn't always walk away from encounters like this. So he stood there, rooted to the spot, his eyes burning with unshed tears as Cooper pocketed the chain and turned away. The humiliation was suffocating. Marcus could feel his chest tightening, the anger and shame threatening to spill over. But before he could do or say anything, the bell above the door jingled, and a familiar voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What's going on here?" Elijah Freeman stepped into the store, his tall frame filling the doorway. He had been on his way home from a meeting when he decided to stop by and surprise Mark. Cooper turned, the smirk faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "Just doing my job. This kid was wearing stolen property, so I confiscated it. Doing my job." "The kid looked suspicious, and I followed my instincts," Cooper said, though his voice lacked the same conviction as before. "You were just violating my son's rights," Elijah interrupted, his voice razor-sharp. "And now you're going to answer for it." The weight of Elijah's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time Cooper looked genuinely uncertain, but the consequences of his actions were only just beginning to unfold. What had started as a moment of humiliation for Marcus was about to turn into something far bigger, a reckoning that would challenge the very systems that allowed men like Cooper to wield power without accountability. And as Marcus watched his father stand firm in the face of injustice, he realized that this was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the corner store shifted in the hours that followed the confrontation. Elijah Freeman had insisted that Sergeant Daniel Cooper return the gold chain to Marcus immediately, a demand the officer met with begrudging compliance. The chain, once a symbol of pride, now felt tainted as it dangled in Marcus's trembling hand. Elijah could see the weight of the encounter etched across his son's face. For Marcus, the shame of being humiliated so publicly hadn't dissipated even with his father's intervention. It lingered heavy and unrelenting. As they drove home, the silence in the car was deafening. Marcus stared out the window, his fingers running over the chain as if trying to reassure himself it was real. Elijah glanced at his son through the rearview mirror, his own thoughts a storm of anger and frustration. He had spent years fighting to carve out a better world for his family, to shield Marcus from the very experiences that had shaped his own youth. Yet, in one cruel moment, it felt as though all his efforts had unraveled. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, Vanessa was already waiting on the porch. Her expression shifted from relief to concern as she saw the look on her husband's face. Without a word, she opened the door and pulled Marcus into a hug. He held on to her tightly, his resolve finally cracking as he let out a shaky breath. Elijah stood back, his jaw tight as he watched his wife comfort their son. He knew they would need to talk about what had happened, but he wasn't ready, not yet. Later that evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the tension was palpable. Marcus picked at his food, his appetite gone, while Vanessa's eyes darted between her husband and son. Elijah broke the silence first, his voice low and steady. "Marcus, I need to know everything, every word, every detail." Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to his plate. He didn't want to relive the encounter, but he also knew his father wouldn't let it go. Slowly, haltingly, he recounted the officer's words, the accusations, and the way the chain had been ripped from his neck. Elijah listened intently, his fists clenched beneath the table. Vanessa's hand rested on Marcus's shoulder, her touch a silent reassurance. When Marcus finished, the room fell silent again. Elijah's voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried an edge that made both Vanessa and Marcus look up. "This isn't over," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Vanessa frowned, worry flickering across her face. Elijah, what are you planning? Elijah shook his head. What I'm planning is justice. That man didn't just humiliate our son, he crossed a line. He used his badge as a weapon, and he's been doing it for years. I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with it. Vanessa's brow furrowed. She knew her husband's resolve could be unyielding, but she who will. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet but deliberate action. Elijah began digging into Cooper's record, using every resource at his disposal. What he found didn't surprise him. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling and misconduct, all swept under the rug. It painted a damning picture of a man who had operated with impunity for far too long. Elijah knew he had to tread carefully. His position within the FBI gave him access to information, but it also came with scrutiny. One misstep could jeopardize not just his career, but his family's safety. Meanwhile, Marcus struggled to process his emotions. At school, whispers followed him in the hallways. Some classmates avoided him, while others offered awkward words of support. He felt exposed, as if the incident had turned him into a symbol rather than a person. The chain around his neck felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder of what had happened. One afternoon, as Marcus sat alone on the bleachers after soccer practice, his coach approached him. Coach Harris, a stern but fair man, had always been one of Marcus's biggest supporters. He sat down next to Marcus, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been quiet lately. Want to talk about it?" Marcus hesitated before shaking his head. "It's nothing, just stuff." Coach Harris gave him a knowing look. "Kid, I've been around long enough to know when something's eating at someone. You don't have to tell me everything, but don't keep it bottled up. You've got people who care about you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to tell someone, anyone, how he felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he muttered a quiet thanks and gathered his things, leaving the field as the sun dipped below the horizon. At home, Elijah's investigation was gaining momentum. He had compiled a damning dossier on Cooper, complete with testimonies from other victims and evidence of misconduct. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized how entrenched the problem was. Cooper wasn't acting alone. There were others, superiors, colleagues, who had turned a blind eye or actively covered for him. It was a system built on silence and complicity. Elijah shared his findings with Vanessa one evening, spreading the documents across the dining table. Her expression shifted from shock to anger as she read through them. "This isn't just about Cooper," she said, her voice trembling. "This is so much bigger." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but it starts with him. If we can take him down, we can start pulling at the threads of the whole system." Vanessa looked at her husband, her concern etched deeply into her features. "Elijah, this is dangerous. You're not just taking on a man, you're taking on an institution. Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Elijah said, though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep that promise. The truth was, he was prepared to risk everything to see justice served. As the tension in the Freeman household grew, so did the stakes. Elijah knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't ignore the fire burning inside him. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself torn between pride in his father's determination and fear of what might happen if things went wrong. And Cooper? He had begun to sense that something was amiss. The confidence he carried after the incident at the corner store was beginning to waver as whispers of an investigation reached his ears. He had underestimated the Freemans, and now, for the first time, he felt the cracks in his armor. But the storm was far from over. What Elijah had uncovered was only the beginning, and the moves he was about to make would set the stage for a confrontation that no one, least of all Cooper, was prepared for. The question wasn't whether justice would be served, but at what cost. And as the pieces began to fall into place, the Freemans braced themselves for a reckoning that would shake everything they thought they knew. The meeting room was dimly lit, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the heavy silence. Elijah sat at the head of the table, his laptop open, a folder of damning evidence spread out before him. Across from him sat his supervisor, Special Agent Linda Graves, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp instincts. She had reviewed the files Elijah presented, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is solid," Linda finally said, her voice calm but weighted. "Cooper's pattern of behavior is undeniable. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Elijah's gaze was steady. "I want accountability. Not just for him, but for every officer who enabled him, who looked the other way while he terrorized people like my son." Linda leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's a tall order. You're not just talking about a single bad cop, you're talking about exposing an entire network. That's going to ruffle feathers. Are you ready for that kind of backlash?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. This isn't just about my family, it's about every family that's been impacted by men like Cooper." Linda studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. When she found none, she nodded. "All right, I'll back you. But we have to do this by the book. No shortcuts, no mistakes. If we're going after a system this big, we need to make sure every step is airtight." Elijah's relief was tempered by the weight of the task ahead. "Understood. Let's get to work." The days that followed were a blur of strategy meetings, late-night calls, and meticulous planning. Elijah and Linda assembled a small, trusted team to assist with the investigation, carefully selecting agents who shared their commitment to justice. They knew the risks. They were essentially taking on an entrenched system of corruption. But the urgency of the mission left no room for hesitation. Meanwhile, Sergeant Daniel Cooper was beginning to feel the pressure. His once confident stride had turned cautious, his eyes darting nervously whenever he entered the precinct. The whispers among his colleagues had grown louder, the looks more pointed. He had heard rumors of an FBI investigation, but no one had approached him directly. The uncertainty gnawed at him, feeding a paranoia that he couldn't shake. It all came to a head on a brisk Thursday morning. Cooper was called into a meeting with his precinct's internal affairs officer, a man named Captain Harris, whose neutral expression gave nothing away. As Cooper entered the room, his stomach churned. Seated at the table were Harris, 2 FBI agents, and Elijah Freeman. Cooper's jaw clenched as he met Elijah's piercing gaze. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice attempting a casual tone that came off as forced. Harris gestured to a chair. "Take a seat, Sergeant." Cooper hesitated but complied, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Elijah remained silent, his presence alone enough to unsettle the room. One of the FBI agents, a woman with a composed demeanor, began laying out the evidence against Cooper. Each piece hit like a hammer: complaints from victims, corroborating witness statements, body cam footage that had been conveniently lost but later recovered. Cooper's facade cracked with each revelation. "This is ridiculous." Cooper finally snapped, his voice rising. "You're taking the word of criminals over a decorated officer? I've served this community for years." Elijah's voice cut through the room like a blade, calm but laced with authority. "You served yourself. You used your badge to intimidate, to steal, to humiliate people who couldn't fight back. But today, you're going to face the consequences." Cooper's eyes narrowed, his bravado flickering. "And who are you to pass judgment? You're just another bureaucrat with a chip on your shoulder." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm a father. A father who watched you strip the dignity from my son because you thought you could get away with it. And I'm an agent who spent my entire career fighting people like you, people who abused the trust placed in them." The room fell silent, the weight of Elijah's words pressing down on everyone present. Cooper shifted uncomfortably, his confidence evaporating. The FBI agents continued presenting their case, each piece of evidence driving the nail further into the coffin. By the time they finished, Cooper's arrogance had been replaced by a hollow resignation. But the reckoning didn't end there. As part of the investigation, the FBI had uncovered a web of complicity within the precinct. Officers who had covered for Cooper, supervisors who had ignored complaints, a culture of silence that had allowed his behavior to thrive. It wasn't just Cooper on the chopping block. It was the system that had protected him. Elijah stood as the meeting concluded, his voice steady as he addressed the room. This isn't just about one man. It's about holding an entire system accountable. And it starts today. Cooper was escorted out of the precinct in handcuffs, the weight of his badge now replaced by the cold steel of justice. As he was led past his colleagues, the silence was deafening. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared with thinly veiled satisfaction, relieved to see justice finally catching up to a man who had brought disgrace to their department. Back at home, Marcus watched the news coverage of Cooper's arrest with a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a lingering sadness that something so deeply personal had become a public spectacle. Vanessa sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Your dad did this for you," she said softly. "For all of us." Marcus nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He understood now that his father's fight wasn't just about their family. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what he had. Elijah returned home late that evening, exhaustion etched into his features. But when he stepped through the door and saw his son's face, the tension melted away. Marcus stood, his gold chain glinting under the warm light, and walked over to his father. Without a word, he hugged him tightly. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah rested a hand on his son's back, his own voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "Always." What happened next would reverberate far beyond the Freeman household, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very fabric of justice in their community. And as they sat together that evening, they knew this was just the beginning of a fight worth fighting. Elijah sat quietly in the dimly lit kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands as the weight of the day settled over him. The house was still, Vanessa and Marcus having gone to bed hours ago, but his mind refused to rest. The images of Cooper's arrest played on a loop in his head, each moment marked by a complicated mix of satisfaction and unease. It wasn't just about Cooper. It never had been. The battle was against something far bigger, something far more insidious. And even though today felt like a victory, Elijah knew it was only a small step in a much longer fight. The faint creak of the stairs pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his gold chain glinting faintly under the kitchen light. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and slid into the chair across from his father. Elijah studied his son, noting the tension still visible in his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed to carry the weight of everything that had happened. "I couldn't sleep," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence. "Every time I close my eyes, I think about everything, what he said, what he did. It's like it's stuck in my head, playing over and over." Elijah set his coffee cup down, his gaze steady as he leaned forward. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been there. That feeling doesn't go away overnight. But you're stronger than he'll ever be, Marcus. What he tried to take from you, he didn't win. You're still standing." Marcus swallowed hard, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. "It doesn't feel like a win. It feels heavy, like I can't let it go." Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's okay to feel that way. What you went through wasn't fair and it wasn't right. But you can't let him control how you move forward. That's how you win, by living your life on your terms, not his." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Marcus nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in his eyes remained. "Did you ever feel like that? Like the anger was too much?" Elijah's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Every day. When I was your age, the things I saw, the way people looked at me, like I didn't belong, like I wasn't enough, it stayed with me for a long time. But then I realized something. Anger doesn't have to consume you. It can drive you. It can push you to be better, to fight back in ways that matter. Marcus looked down at the chain around his neck, his fingers brushing over it absently. "I want to be like you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be strong." Elijah reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. "You already are. Don't ever forget that." The moment stretched, unspoken emotions filling the silence. Finally, Marcus stood, his shoulders a little less tense than before. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly before retreating back upstairs. Elijah watched him go, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Marcus, but tonight had been a step forward. The next morning, the Freeman household was buzzing with energy. News of Cooper's arrest had spread quickly, and the media had picked up on the story. Vanessa stood in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she fielded calls from friends and colleagues, while Marcus sat on the couch, scrolling through headlines on his tablet. Elijah was in the kitchen, reviewing notes for the press conference scheduled later that day. As the family prepared for the day ahead, the doorbell rang. Vanessa opened the door to find Linda Graves standing on the porch, her expression unreadable. Elijah appeared behind his wife, his brow furrowing as he stepped forward. "Linda," he greeted, his tone cautious. "What's going on?" Linda stepped inside, glancing briefly at Marcus before turning her attention back to Elijah. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "Privately." Elijah nodded, leading her into his office and closing the door behind them. Linda wasted no time. "There's been a development," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "We've uncovered more connections, more people involved in covering for Cooper, but it's bigger than we thought. Some of the names on this list, they're not just local. This goes up the chain." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the names. His jaw tightened as he realized the implications. "This isn't just about the precinct," he said, his voice grim. "This is systemic." Linda nodded. "Exactly. And if we're going to take this further, we need to be prepared for the fallout. This isn't just going to ruffle feathers, it's going to blow the whole thing wide open." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had known from the beginning that this fight wouldn't be easy, but the scale of what they were up against was staggering. "We can't back down," he said firmly. "Not now." Linda studied him for a moment before nodding. The press conference that afternoon was a whirlwind of cameras, reporters, and flashing lights. Elijah stood at the podium, his demeanor calm but resolute. He spoke about the importance of accountability, about the need to confront the systems that allowed men like Cooper to thrive. His words were measured but powerful, resonating with a crowd hungry for change. As the conference ended, Marcus watched from the sidelines, a newfound sense of pride swelling in his chest. For the first time since the incident, he felt like his voice mattered, like his story could make a difference. Vanessa placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile warm and reassuring. "Your dad's doing something incredible," she said, "and so are you, just by being here." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of something bigger, a movement for justice that wouldn't be silenced. And as he watched his father step away from the podium, he knew this was only the beginning. The press conference marked a turning point, but the days that followed brought a cascade of complications, victories, and challenges that no one in the Freeman household could have anticipated. Elijah returned home that evening to find Marcus sitting at the kitchen table, his tablet glowing with a series of notifications. Social media was ablaze with the story, headlines proclaiming the downfall of Sergeant Daniel Cooper and the corruption within his precinct. Marcus looked up as his father walked in, his face a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "They're calling you a hero," Marcus said, sliding the tablet across the table. The screen displayed an article featuring Elijah's photo, his words from the press conference quoted prominently. But some people, they're saying you're tearing the system apart. Elijah sighed, setting his briefcase down and sitting beside his son. Change isn't easy, Marcus. There will always be people who resist it, who feel threatened by it. What matters is that we're doing what's right. Marcus nodded slowly, but the uncertainty lingered. Doesn't it bother you that some people think you're the bad guy? Elijah's gaze softened as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. What bothers me is the thought of doing nothing, letting people like Cooper keep hurting others because it's easier to look the other way. What we're doing, it's bigger than us, and it's worth it. The conversation stayed with Marcus long after his father left the room. He wanted to believe in the fight for justice, to feel the same certainty his father carried. But the weight of public scrutiny, the whispers at school, and the lingering fear of what might come next gnawed at him. It was a struggle he wasn't sure how to navigate. Meanwhile, the fallout from the investigation spread like wildfire. The FBI's findings revealed a tangled web of corruption, implicating officers, supervisors, and even city officials. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, sparking protests, town hall meetings, and heated debates about accountability and systemic reform. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, his days consumed by meetings with community leaders, legal teams, and journalists eager to cover the story. One evening, as Elijah sat in his office reviewing documents, his phone buzzed with a call from Linda. Her tone was calm but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "We've got another problem," she said. "Some of the names we've uncovered, people higher up the chain, they're pushing back hard. They're trying to discredit the investigation." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What are they saying?" "They're claiming bias," Linda explained, saying you're too personally involved because of what happened to Marcus. "They're trying to paint this as a vendetta rather than a legitimate investigation." Elijah's jaw tightened. Of course they are. They're scared. They know we're close to uncovering the whole truth. Linda's voice softened slightly. "You need to be careful, Elijah. The more pressure we put on them, the more desperate they'll get. And desperate people make dangerous moves." Elijah nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll be careful, but I'm not backing down." The call ended, but the warning lingered in Elijah's mind. He knew Linda was right. Every step forward brought new risks, new challenges, but he also knew they were too far in to turn back. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct, their chants echoing through the streets as calls for reform grew louder. Inside, officers whispered nervously, their loyalty to their department clashing with the undeniable truth of the evidence against them. Some resigned quietly, unable to face the scrutiny. Others doubled down, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. For Cooper, the walls were closing in. His arraignment had been scheduled, and the charges against him were mounting. He sat in his cell, his once cocky demeanor replaced by a grim silence. His attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Grant Holloway, visited, each meeting filled with tense discussions about strategy. "They're making you the scapegoat," Holloway said during one visit, his tone clipped. "They're throwing you under the bus to protect themselves." Cooper's hands tightened into fists. "You think I don't know that? They used me, and now they're hanging me out to dry." "Then fight back," Holloway urged. "If you go down, take them with you. Testify. Expose the whole operation." Cooper hesitated, the prospect of turning on his colleagues weighing heavily on him. He had spent years playing the game, rising through the ranks by towing the line and looking the other way. To betray that system now felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. But as the evidence against him piled up, he began to see the truth. The system he had protected wouldn't protect him in return. While Cooper wrestled with his choices, Elijah faced his own moral dilemmas. The deeper the investigation went, the more it revealed about the rot within the system. But it also uncovered stories of officers who had tried to do the right thing, who had spoken out against corruption only to be silenced or punished. Elijah found himself grappling with a question he couldn't ignore. How do you fight a system without destroying the good within it? The answer wasn't clear, but Elijah knew one thing for certain: justice had to come first. And as he prepared for the next phase of the investigation, he felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was anything but certain. At home, Marcus found himself drawn into the fight in ways he hadn't expected. He started attending community meetings with Vanessa, listening as neighbors shared their stories and frustrations. He saw the pain and resilience in their faces, the determination to create a better future despite the odds. It was a side of the fight he hadn't fully understood before, and it changed something in him. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Marcus spoke up. "What happens if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice tentative. "What if nothing changes?" Elijah looked at his son, his expression thoughtful. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply, "because giving up isn't an option." The words resonated with Marcus, their simplicity masking the profound truth beneath them. He realized then that the fight wasn't just about winning, it was about standing up, about refusing to let fear or doubt silence them. As the investigation reached its final stages, the Freemans braced themselves for what lay ahead. The truth was coming to light, and with it, the consequences of challenging a system built on silence and complicity. But even as the tension mounted, they held on to one unshakable belief: justice was worth the fight, and they were ready to see it through to the end. The night was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the Freeman household. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out before him, his expression a mix of focus and fatigue. He rubbed his temples, the weight of the investigation bearing down on him more heavily than ever. The revelations of the past weeks had been staggering, and the web of corruption they'd uncovered seemed to stretch further with each passing day. It wasn't just about Cooper anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed men like him to thrive. The creak of a floorboard made Elijah look up. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, concern etched into her features. She stepped into the room, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vanessa reached out, resting her hand on his. "You're carrying too much," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "You can't do this alone." Elijah met her gaze, his expression softening. "I know," he admitted, his voice low. "But it feels like if I don't keep pushing, if I let up even for a moment, everything we've worked for could fall apart." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this, Eli. Look around you. The community is rallying, people are speaking out, Marcus is finding his voice. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's all of ours." Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He wanted to believe her, to trust that the momentum they had built would carry them through. But the threats were becoming more overt. Anonymous calls, veiled warnings from people who didn't want the investigation to go any further. Elijah had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This felt personal. "I just don't want to put you or Marcus in danger," he said finally, his voice tinged with guilt. "This fight, it's bigger than I expected. The fight will still be here tomorrow." Elijah watched her leave, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the heaviness of the moment. She was right, as she often was. They were in this together. The following day brought a new wave of developments. Linda called Elijah early in the morning, her tone brisk. "We've got movement," she said. "Cooper's attorney reached out. He's willing to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence." Elijah felt a surge of vindication. What's he offering? Names, details, evidence? Linda replied, "He's ready to bring the whole house of cards down." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "Then let's make it happen." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of negotiations and strategy sessions. Cooper's testimony was a bombshell, implicating not just his immediate colleagues, but high-ranking officials who had turned a blind eye to his actions for years. It was the breakthrough they needed, but it came with complications. Cooper's willingness to cooperate made him both an asset and a liability. His admissions painted a picture of a department steeped in corruption, but they also raised questions about how such behavior had gone unchecked for so long. The press was relentless, hounding Elijah for comments as the story exploded into the national spotlight. He kept his responses measured, focused on the facts. But inside, he felt the strain of being thrust into the center of a storm that showed no signs of abating. At home, Marcus watched the coverage with growing unease. He had always admired his father's strength, but seeing him under such intense scrutiny made him realize just how much pressure Elijah was under. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Marcus spoke up. "Dad, do you ever regret it? Taking all of this on?" Elijah turned to his son, his expression thoughtful. "Regret it? No. There are moments when it feels overwhelming, sure. But I don't regret standing up for what's right, do you?" Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Sometimes I wish it hadn't happened, that I didn't have to think about it all the time." Elijah leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I know it's a lot, Marcus, and I wish I could take that weight off your shoulders. But what you've done, just by speaking out, by being brave, that's more than most people ever do. I'm proud of you." Marcus looked up, his father's words sinking in. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you too." The days that followed were a blur of depositions, meetings, and preparations for the upcoming trial. Cooper's testimony proved to be the keystone of the case, corroborating much of the evidence Elijah and his team had uncovered. But it also revealed just how deeply entrenched the corruption was. The list of names grew longer, and with it, the scope of the investigation expanded. At the same time, the backlash intensified. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some in support of the investigation, others decrying it as a witch hunt. The tension in the air was palpable, a community divided by the revelations and the difficult questions they raised. For Elijah, the stakes had never been higher. He knew the trial would be a turning point, not just for Cooper, but for the entire system. It was a chance to set a precedent, to show that accountability was possible. But it was also a risk. A misstep could undermine everything they had worked for. On the night before the trial, Elijah sat alone in his office, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Vanessa found him there, her presence a quiet comfort. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "You've done everything you can," she said softly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already made a difference." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "I just want it to matter," he said, "for Marcus, for everyone who's been hurt by this system." Vanessa squeezed his arm. "It already does. You've shown people that change is possible. That's more than most people ever accomplish." Elijah looked at her, gratitude and love shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for always being here." Vanessa smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Always." As the trial began the next day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, community members, and officials filled the seats, all eyes on the proceedings. Elijah sat at the prosecution's table, his focus unwavering as the evidence was presented, and Cooper took the stand. The tension in the room was electric, every word carrying the weight of years of injustice. And as the trial unfolded, it became clear that this was about more than one man. It was about a system being held to account, about a community demanding better, about a family standing together in the face of unimaginable pressure. What happened in that courtroom would shape the future, not just for the Freemans, but for everyone watching. And as the trial neared its conclusion, one thing was certain: the fight for justice was far from over, but Elijah and his family were ready to see it through. The courtroom was a hive of barely contained energy as the prosecution continued to build its case against Daniel Cooper. Elijah sat at the front of the room, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of why they were there. The trial had become a lightning rod for tension in the community, with every new revelation sparking waves of discussion and debate. Outside, protesters on both sides clashed in heated exchanges, their voices rising above the hum of the city. Inside, however, the atmosphere was solemn, charged with the weight of the truth being uncovered. Cooper sat at the defendant's table, his posture stiff and defensive. His attorney, Grant Holloway, had managed to maintain a veneer of calm professionalism, but even he couldn't completely mask the strain of defending a man whose actions had left such a glaring stain on the department. Cooper's face remained impassive as witness after witness took the stand, recounting instances of harassment, intimidation, and abuse. Each testimony was another crack in the armor he had spent years building, each word another step closer to the reckoning he could no longer avoid. Elijah watched intently as a young woman named Alicia took the stand. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she recounted an encounter with Cooper that mirrored Marcus's experience. She described being stopped on her way home from work, accused of theft without evidence, and humiliated in front of her neighbors. Her voice caught when she described the fear she had felt, the helplessness of knowing that no one would come to her defense. "Why didn't you file a complaint?" the defense attorney asked, his tone sharp. Alicia's gaze hardened. "Because I knew it wouldn't matter. People like me don't get justice when it's our word against a badge." The courtroom fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Elijah's fists clenched beneath the table, his heart aching with the familiarity of her pain. It was a pain he had spent his career fighting to dismantle, a pain he had vowed to protect his family from. And yet, here they were. During a recess, Elijah stepped outside to gather his thoughts. The air was cool, the noise of the protesters a distant hum. Marcus joined him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. They stood in silence for a moment before Marcus spoke. "Do you think they'll believe her?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Elijah turned to his son, his expression thoughtful. "They should, but what matters more is that she had the courage to speak up. That's how change starts." Marcus nodded, though his face remained troubled. "It's just, what if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" Elijah placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm. "Change is slow, Marcus. It's frustrating and messy, and it doesn't always happen the way we want it to. But every step forward matters, no matter how small." Marcus looked up at his father, his eyes searching for reassurance. "I just want it to be over. I want to stop thinking about it all the time." Elijah's heart ached for his son, for the burden he carried. "I know," he said softly, "but what you're feeling, what you've been through, it matters, and it's going to make a difference." Inside the courtroom, the prosecution called its next witness, a fellow officer who had worked alongside Cooper for years. The man's testimony was a turning point, revealing not only Cooper's actions but the complicity of those around him. He described the culture of silence, where officers were encouraged to protect their own at the expense of justice. His words painted a damning picture of a system that had failed the very people it was meant to serve. As the trial progressed, Cooper's demeanor shifted. The bravado that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a sullen resignation. His attorney fought to salvage what little credibility he had left, but the weight of the evidence was insurmountable. Cooper's testimony, when it finally came, was a desperate attempt to mitigate his culpability. He pointed fingers, naming names, trying to shift the blame onto others. But his words rang hollow, a stark contrast to the courage of those who had spoken out against him. The courtroom grew tense as the prosecution delivered its closing arguments. The lead attorney, a composed woman with a sharp intellect, laid out the case with precision, emphasizing the impact of Cooper's actions on the community and the urgent need for accountability. She spoke of Marcus, of Alicia, of the countless others whose voices had been silenced for too long. Her words were a call to action, a plea for justice that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the atmosphere shifted once again. The tension was palpable, a collective breath held as the hours stretched on. Elijah sat with Vanessa and Marcus, their hands clasped together in quiet solidarity. The waiting was excruciating, each passing moment a reminder of how much was at stake. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Cooper was found guilty on multiple counts, his actions deemed a gross abuse of power. The decision sent a ripple through the room, a mixture of relief and vindication for those who had fought so hard for this moment. But for Elijah, the victory was bittersweet. The trial had exposed not just Cooper's crimes, but the deep flaws within the system itself. The work was far from over, and he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Still, as he looked at Marcus, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had taken a stand, and they had made a difference, and that was something worth fighting for. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers and tears as the verdict spread. Elijah stood with his family, his arm around Marcus's shoulders, as they faced the sea of people who had come together to demand justice. It was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. As the sun set over the city, Elijah reflected on everything they had been through. The pain, the anger, the resilience. It had all led to this moment. And though the fight was far from over, he knew they were stronger for it. Together, they would continue to push for change, for a future where stories like Marcus's were no longer the norm, but a thing of the past. And for the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself to hope. As the dust began to settle after the trial, life for the Freeman family found a new rhythm, one shaped by healing and hope. Marcus returned to school with a quiet sense of pride, his confidence growing each day. Though the memory of what had happened still lingered, he found strength in knowing his story had sparked something bigger. His classmates no longer whispered behind his back. Instead, they often stopped to tell him how brave he had been. Some even joined him at community meetings, inspired by his willingness to stand up for what was right. For Vanessa, the trial's conclusion was a moment of relief, but also a call to action. She had watched her family endure the worst of what prejudice and injustice could bring, but instead of letting it break her, she used it as fuel. She began organizing local forums for parents, focusing on how to prepare their children to navigate a world that didn't always treat them fairly. Her warmth and resolve made her a beacon of hope for others, and she found solace in helping her community grow stronger. Elijah, however, couldn't rest just yet. The trial had been a victory, but it was only the beginning of a larger battle. The investigation had uncovered deep flaws in the justice system, and Elijah felt a responsibility to keep pushing for change. He worked tirelessly with local leaders and advocacy groups, using his position to push for reforms within law enforcement. His efforts led to the implementation of new training programs, stricter accountability measures, and a broader conversation about systemic racism. Slowly but surely, the seeds of change were being planted, and Elijah knew that was worth every sleepless night. As for Daniel Cooper, his fall from grace was swift and unrelenting. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, he faced the consequences of years of unchecked abuse. But even in his downfall, there was an opportunity for reflection. In a letter he wrote from prison, which was later shared with the press, Cooper admitted to the harm he had caused and expressed a desire to be part of the solution when he eventually re-entered society. Whether his words were genuine or not, they served as a reminder that even the most flawed individuals could have the capacity for change if they chose to confront their actions. The community, too, was transformed by the events surrounding the trial. The protests that had once divided people now became a source of unity, with neighbors coming together to demand better from their leaders. New programs were launched to bridge gaps between law enforcement and the communities they served, creating spaces for dialogue and understanding. It wasn't perfect, and progress was slow, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. For Marcus, the journey wasn't just about justice, it was about finding his voice. Months after the trial, he was invited to speak at a youth leadership conference, an opportunity he initially hesitated to accept. Standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, he felt a familiar wave of nerves wash over him. But then he remembered his father's words, that every step forward mattered, no matter how small. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. He talked about the chain around his neck and what it symbolized, about the day he felt powerless and the moment he reclaimed his dignity. His words resonated with the audience, and by the time he finished, the room was filled with applause. It was a moment Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life, proof that his story had the power to inspire others. Elijah and Vanessa watched their son from the audience, their hearts swelling with pride. For Elijah, seeing Marcus on that stage was a reminder of why he had fought so hard. It wasn't just about dismantling a corrupt system. It was about creating a world where his son and others like him could thrive without fear. As they walked out of the conference together, turned to his parents with a smile. "Thank you," he said simply. It was all he needed to say. The legacy of what the Freemans had endured extended far beyond their own family. Their fight for justice became a catalyst for change, a story that inspired countless others to take a stand against injustice. And while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, they faced it together, knowing they were stronger for everything they had overcome. Reflecting on this story, one can't help but wonder, what would you do if you were in their shoes? Would you have the courage to speak out, to stand up against something so deeply entrenched? The Freeman family's journey is a powerful reminder that change often starts with one voice, one step, one act of courage. It's not easy, and it's not always immediate, but every effort matters. Their story shows us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice is worth fighting for. What did this story make you feel? Did it inspire you to think about how you can create change in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, thought-provoking narratives. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.